Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, if you've been following First Rate Tutors for long enough, you will know that we've helped hundreds of GCSE students go from struggling with 2s and 3s to getting 6s, 7s, 8s and 9s in the final GCSE English Literature Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams, as well as in their language Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams. And we have achieved this through our GCSE Literature Weeks, which is our one-off GCSE Literature Paper 1 and Paper 2 masterclasses, where I go over how to write model responses and I write model answers for the GCSE Literature Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams. And this includes Macbeth, Inspector Calls, Christmas Carol, Unseen Poetry, Love and Relationships, Power and Conflict, Jekyll and Hyde. But also, we have achieved this through our weekly GCSE Language Paper 1 and Paper 2 masterclasses, where every single week at 5 to 6 p.m. we literally answer a different AQA past paper question so that my students who are all on the road to grade 9 in the final Language Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams know exactly what it takes, and they put in that consistent practice to get in those 6s, 7s, 8s and 9s. And of course, also, we have achieved this through YouTube and TikTok, where hundreds of you guys have also found my guidance and feedback helpful as you are on your GCSE journey and preparing for your final exams. Now, with just 14 weeks left to the GCSE English Literature Paper 1 exams that kick off on the 12th of May, what I want to do within this lesson is to show you, those of you who are really diligent, you are literally focusing on getting at least a 6, 7, 8 or 9. You want to start jumping up and boosting your grades, and you're doing this through practice. What I want to do within this lesson is to show you the difference between a grade 4 GCSE paragraph for an Inspector Calls and a grade 9 response. Remember that when it comes to doing really well in the GCSE English Literature Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams, not only do you need to practice consistently and improve in your practice, get that speed reading and speed reading writing up, but also remember, getting amazing grades is a function of you knowing what does a grade 4 response look like, and what does a grade 9 response look like, and how can I tweak my answers and my practice when I'm thinking about the quality of what I've written in my past paper practice, in my mocks. If I'm closer to the grade 4 response, or even if my essay quality is even worse than the grade 4 response, what can I learn from these student paragraphs, from these student exemplars, to start shifting and improving in my practice to start moving closer to the grade 9 paragraph. Remember that to improve in your essay writing quality, not only do you need to practice, but you also need to be looking at amazing examples of essays where not only can you borrow the language that other students have used so that you get the same results, i.e. grades 8 and 9s, but also, of course, you then apply this to past paper practice. And that's literally what I do in my GCSE Literature Week, when I'm going to be going over the 2023 exam for an Inspector Calls and writing a grade 9 model answer for the 2 questions that came up in this year's exam. Okay, so this is the 2023 exam. On the 19th of February at 5 to 6 p.m, I'll be writing grade 9 model answers for the 2 questions that came up, so that my students will not only see how to put together a really solid paragraph, including a thesis statement, but then they take that away with them and use that as part of the revision. And obviously, in addition to that, not only do they get an Inspector Calls cheat sheet with all the character quotes, context and themes in one place, but also they get a live recording of the lesson afterwards that they can come back to over and over again as they are preparing for the final GCSE exam. So make sure you join in. It's going to be during February half term. So let's have a look at the grade 4 paragraph to begin with. As I said, the best way to improve in your essay writing is have a look at other student responses and other student exemplars. And as you can see behind me, what I've done is I found a student response. I took one of the paragraphs. The student literally just about got a grade 4 in this response. Okay, so if they had literally 2 marks less, they would have actually failed and gotten a 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that grade 4 paragraph first. Have a look as I'm reading through this grade 4 paragraph and ask yourself genuinely, okay? Because at this stage, you need to be asking yourself very critical questions so that you can improve and not find that the weeks are going and, you know, we now have 14 weeks, then it's suddenly 13, 12 and so on, but you're not improving, okay? So let's have a look at the grade 4 response to begin with. This is what a grade 4 response looks like when it comes to Inspector Calls. And the question that these two paragraphs were responding to was how Priestley presents Mrs. Burling's character, okay? So this is the grade 4 response that literally just about got a grade 4, okay? So the student wrote, Mrs. Burling is a very cold woman as she thinks that she is better than anyone else. She tries to bully Sheila, telling her to go to bed, you're looking tired. She thinks she's an important person like Mr. Burling as she tells Inspector Gore off. She says, my husband was Lord Mayor, showing Mr. Burling is important. She does not care about poor people and doesn't help them as she thinks they haven't earned it. She calls Daisy girls of that class as she looks down on poor women. Now, the reason why this got a grade 4 is for a few reasons that this student actually did well on, which meant that they just about missed failing in this question to actually traveling over and getting a pass, a grade 4. Number one, what the student has done really well, and this is something you need to make sure you're doing consistently in your practice and in your essays when you're practicing for Inspector Calls, is they have used the keywords in the question. In this case, they were asked to talk about how Mrs. Burling is presented, therefore they keep on referring back to Mrs. Burling. Another thing that they've done, and I've actually color coded, okay, so the blue is the point, then the red is the evidence. They have also added some good supporting evidence that shows their awareness of how Mrs. Burling's character is like, okay, so they use quotations like how she speaks to Sheila, you're looking tired. Also, she said, you know, my husband is Lord Mayor. And also she says girls of that class, okay? So they've done that really well, and that's basically what got them just about a pass. Now, what's really interesting in this response is it's actually not very brief, but I've actually color-coded it to show you that what they have done, and this is what's kept them stuck at a grade 4, at a very low grade 4, by the way, is they have not done any form of analysis. This is a very shallow essay, okay? So they've basically done a point evidence, point evidence, point evidence. And usually students tend to do this a lot, right? So students who get 3s and 4s, they don't necessarily not write a lot, okay? So you'll be really shocked if you see some student exemplars that got 3s, which is basically a fail. They've written like 2 whole pages. But those are 2 whole pages of just point evidence, point evidence, point evidence. They are just describing what's going on in the play. They're not going into any level of analysis. They're not mentioning things like context. They're not mentioning things like symbols. And they're not going beyond the quotation and unpacking what's going on in the quotation in connection to the question. In this case, it's how Mrs. Burling's character is presented. Let's now look at what a grade 9 response looks like. Now, even if you don't necessarily care about getting a grade 9, maybe you're like, do you know what? I don't really care about a 9. I just want to get a 6. It's really important to see what a perfect response looks like, and then you can see language you can borrow and then start including, okay? So your answer doesn't have to be as detailed as this grade 9 response, but if you want to start moving away from this quality of response, you need to be looking at top tier answers, which then show you what you can improve on. And again, that is the principle on which I have my GCSE Literature Week, because when I write these grade 9 responses, I always tell my students, look guys, if you're even just aiming for a 6 or a 7, you need to start borrowing some of this language. You don't necessarily have to go into as much depth as I go into, but there does need to be some depth. There does need to be some analysis. There does need to be some context and maybe a symbol here or there. That is how you start moving away from struggling with 2s, 3s and 4s to finding yourself at least firmly in grade 6 category. Let's have a look at how the grade 9 response differs from the grade 6 response. Now, again, I've color coded it with the point in blue. Red is evidence, so they've quoted. Then, as you can see here in color black, I have shown the explanation that they've delved into, okay? And then the link in purple, okay? And one of the things I want you to pay attention to is this third step in the paragraph, the explanation, because that is where the marks reside. So this is what a grade 9 response looks like on Mrs. Burling's character, and generally what a grade 9 Inspector Calls essay looks like, okay? So the student says, Mrs. Burling is presented as a symbol of capitalism as she upholds the capitalist values Mr. Burling represents when she defends him to the inspector. She highlights that her husband was Lord Mayor. So They've started off really well with an opening point, then the evidence, but they haven't stopped there and then said, oh, let me add another evidence. Oh, let me add another point. Oh, how else is Mrs. Berling shown? And then they start describing. They've actually then stopped because they're now zooming in on that piece of evidence and going into a deep dive. That's how you now start hitting high grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, depending on how much depth you go into. So now this is the vital part of their paragraph, which is what got them a grade 9. So they write, Priestley uses this declarative sentence technique to convey how Mrs. Berling upholds capitalism, context and ideas by defending men like Mr. Berling who exploited their workers like Eva Smith. The noun mayor. So now they've not only quoted, they have now zoomed in and mentioned one specific technique. Okay, so there's two techniques. They mentioned declarative sentence and a noun. Okay, so now they're zooming in and really now going into a real depth in their analysis. The noun mayor presents her as officious, ambitious language, and Priestley uses her to convey his socialist message of change. She is revealed as playing an essential role in upholding capitalism, which created deep class inequality, as Priestley uses her to show how capitalism was upheld by upper middle class women like her, who selfishly guarded their families and businesses at the expense of the poor. This is what has gotten them that 9. It's not how they've started. How they've started is simply they're just showing they understand the question and they're demonstrating AO1 skills. Then they've mentioned things like, declarative sentence and so on, which is AO2 skills. However, the majority part of their essay and of their paragraph is them unpacking. They've talked about Priestley's message, context. They have talked about symbolism, how Mrs. Berling is a symbol of capitalism. This is really powerful analysis that immediately impresses the examiner and gets them on side. Okay, they're now on your side, and basically it's up to you to determine how far you are from grade 6, how far you rise to get 7, 8 or 9, depending on how many paragraphs now you start writing. But then they're not done there, because they finish by linking back to the question to show that they have a really full handle of what's going on in the essay. They say, thus Mrs. Berling is a symbol of capitalism as she highlights how many upper middle class women upheld social and class inequality by defending men like Mr. Berling. So this paragraph is a grade 9 paragraph for a number of factors, and the key difference is when you look at the grade 4 versus grade 9, they go into very deep analysis. What's also interesting is, unlike the grade 4 response, I've only used one quotation. So it's not about having a bunch of different quotations. It's about taking a few, maybe 1, maximum 2 per paragraph, and then doing a deep dive, analyzing symbols, context, themes, Priestley's message, how we as the audience are affected, synthesizing that all into one paragraph. And as I said, guys, I will show you how to do this and how to achieve this in my GCSE one-off literature masterclass on Inspector Calls on the 19th of February during half term. If you're looking at this and you're like, okay, I'd like to move my essay closer to this, what does that look like? What does a full mark essay look like? Plus with a thesis statement, because very likely the student also started with a thesis statement that also feeds into whether they get a grade 9 or not. I will show you exactly how to do that in that masterclass, which is on the 19th of February at 5 to 6 p.m. Okay, so I hope you found that this is helpful. As you can see here, this lacks very much depth. It's literally just a grocery list of different quotations. Mrs. Berling is this, here's a quote. Mrs. Berling is that, here's a quote. Move away from that if you want to access at least a 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9, and you need to start moving towards this. So I hope you found this helpful, and thanks so much for listening.